Tundra Media presents The Mayor Helps, with the Mayor of Victoria, British Columbia, Lisa Helps. Have your say. Send your questions and comments to themayorhelps.com. They could be included in next week's
Victoria
show.
Businesses to know that we're working.
And now, here's your host, from beautiful Victoria, British Columbia, Dave Hatt.
Welcome to the Mayor Helps podcast with Mayor Lisa Helps. My name is Dave Hatt, and as its sign says behind me, it's July 8th, 2020. And today we're going to be speaking with Brent Toderian later on, and he's worked extensively for 25 years, city planning. He's an urban planner, urban design, and something that when you check his Twitter feed and there's ongoing discussion, and he's enlightening people about bike lanes and how bikes impact cities. And what I wanted to do, because in the city of Victoria, just this week, correct me if I'm wrong, Mayor Helps, the go-ahead has been given, the green light's been given to forge ahead on the next set of bike lanes. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
So now, how do you come about the decision to move forward with bike lanes? What is the science based on it? Because I'm speaking right now from the guy that owns the business, the Main Street business on the corner, where if bike lanes go in front of my shop during the construction phase, certainly it's going to severely negatively impact my business. After that, it may or may not even out. But how do you go about making the decision as to which arteries to flag to use as bike lanes?
That's a really great question. So really bike lanes, just like traffic lanes, traffic lights, any kind of road movement measures begin with an engineering approach. So it's not me walking out there and saying, I like that corridor or I like that corridor. Our engineers go out and they start by counting car traffic and they notice how many cars are on which roads. And one of the key things to consider when building a bike corridor is if we put bikes on there and displace cars to a certain degree, where else will those cars go, and how can that be mitigated? So that's really a consideration, and that's why. And I know that you and I had a conversation about Cook versus Vancouver, and for people who are watching this show from across the country, there are two main arteries that run north-south in Victoria. Well, there are many, but there were two that were being considered for a bike corridor. Vancouver, which is a little more hilly, but a quieter street from a car traffic point of view. And then Cook Street, which is flatter and therefore better for cycling, but has way more car traffic on it. And so our staff ultimately ended up recommending Vancouver, because if we had built two-way separated lanes on Cook Street, that would have displaced or backed up traffic, causing more greenhouse gas emissions and more congestion, which is what bike lanes are meant not to do. So that's one way that we decide in terms of which corridor. And then the other equally important piece is connectivity. So the next pieces that we've put in that we're making a decision about this week are meant to connect neighborhoods into the downtown and begin to connect neighborhoods with each other. So the way that I like to describe it, and Brent might say something similar, is imagine if we were creating an electricity grid, but the wires stopped before they got to your house and they couldn't power your TV or your washing machine. Same thing with a bike network. The whole point is connectivity, so that people who don't feel safe riding their bikes can basically get from their front door to their school, to their recreation center, to their job in a safe and connected way. So that's another key consideration.
Great. Thank you for the answer to the question. It's I spent time living in the States, and I only had access to a bicycle, and so I rode my bike everywhere I went, and parts of it, in LA with a bike were a little dodgy, to say the least.
Yeah.
So if I had bike lanes, it would have been better. So why don't we take a break now, and then we'll jump in on the other side of this break and
Have your say. Send your questions and comments to themayorhelps.com. They could be included in next week's show.
Welcome back to Ask the Mayor. And this segment around, we've got Andrew Langford. He is the co-founder of Twist of Fate Cocktails, and he also, by happenstance, is the co-host of Obstacle Course Podcast. So welcome to the Mayor Helps, Andrew, and meet Mayor Lisa Helps and ask your question.
Thanks. Good to be here. So my question is in relation to the events community at which we are part of with Twist of Fate. So I'm wondering, how might you weigh the risks of the potential public health risks of hosting events, even on a small scale, against the survival of many businesses in Victoria that depends on events or tourism or a combination to survive? And an example that I had was the Black Lives Matter rally that took place in Centennial Square, which was criticized by some as being too risky, but it had a highly positive impact on those who attended, and showed in hindsight of no real evidence of spreading COVID. And just a kind of larger scale question on the same in the same realm: what processes or practices do you lean on, Mayor Helps, for making challenging decisions?
Great question. So we'll start with events. I think events, as long as they follow public health protocols, are okay. The biggest stumbling block really for everyone is the no gatherings of 50 people or more, right? Because you can have as many events as you want with less than 50 people as long as they're physically distanced. I think that Dr. Bonnie Henry got freaked out by that dental conference. And I would have too if I were her, right? There were, I don't know, thousands of people gathering, and it's just like spread of infection. Yeah. So I really do, and the gatherings of 50 people or more isn't just a British Columbia prohibition. I think that's kind of the standard until there's a vaccine. So that makes it really tricky. Like, we can't even hold council meetings because we can only fit 31 people into our chambers in a physically distanced way. But if there are creative ways to bring people together, that of groups of 49 people where those physical distance measures can be met, I would say that would be good. One of the things that we're doing, and I'm so proud of our staff for recommending this to us, we have festival investment grants that we give out every year, and we're just about to approve them on Thursday. And we're giving out a whole bunch of money, $250,000, to organizations that aren't really even going to hold festivals, because we know that some of these entities need that cash for survival. So some of them are moving to more online formats. So I think that the arts and culture community in Victoria, the events community, is part of our special sauce. We're a really small community, but your companies like yours and others, and the arts and culture community, like it's part of our DNA. So we're trying to think creatively about what we can do. But I wouldn't advise, because I'm not Dr. Henry. She'll give us the go ahead when we can gather. And my gut feeling says that it may be that gatherings of 50 or more are allowed outside before they're inside. And I think that would give us some creative options. And then your second question, what do I do to make challenging decisions? I think two things. One is have the courage to make them, because it's really hard to make challenging decisions, especially when everyone else has a better answer. And then the second is, as much as possible, rely on either evidence, data, or looking around to other cities and see what's working and what's not, kind of based on past experience of others.
Amazing. Well, thanks for all of that, and appreciate the time. And yeah, as Dave mentioned, we do have a podcast, so maybe you'll come on ours at one point if there's time for that as well.
If you invite me, I will come. And also, I'd like to try one of your amazing cocktails sometime.
Okay. Yeah, it's on to both.
Okay, sounds good. Maybe
Cool.
we can have a cocktail and do a podcast.
It's a deal.
Okay, done.
Okay,
Thank you, Andrew. Take care. Have a great day.
Thanks, you as well.
Have your say. Send your questions and comments to themayorhelps.com. They could be included in next week's show. And now, Mayor Lisa Helps sits down with this week's special guest.
For 28 years, our next guest, Brent Toderian, has worked across Canada and the world in the field of advanced urbanism, city planning, and urban design. In 2012, he founded Toderian Urban Works, and prior to that, he was Vancouver, British Columbia's chief planner, which included work on the planning and design of the 2010 Winter Olympics. From Toronto to Calgary, Medellin to Oslo, Brent has worked with the best and brightest, and he frequently shares his thoughts through appearances on CBC Radio, Huffington Post, and his Twitter feed, among other outlets. We are happy to have him stop by, and welcome to the Mayor Helps with Lisa Helps, Brent Toderian. How are you today?
I'm doing wonderfully, thank you, and nice to see you, Mayor Helps.
Yeah, nice to see you too. I've only ever seen you on Twitter, so it's nice to see you in the flesh, or what the new flesh looks like in this
yes, the new
reality.
So one of the things that we've been discussing, as it's particularly relevant time-wise in Victoria, is bike lanes. And so it's relating to COVID. We've seen a lot of the use of public space has shifted. It's changed, whether it's accommodating small businesses. But one of the things I wanted to ask you was the use of bike lanes in other cities and how it impacts the livability of the city, the positiveness of the city. What is it that you see? Because we have people that are on social media that, buck the notion of bike lanes. They want to remain the streets to just be cars only. They fight against it. What is some information you might be able to share with residents that are in the process of having their cities convert some car traffic lanes to bike lanes? How does that help improve?
Well, so many ways we can tackle this conversation. This was a huge conversation for the last 5, maybe going on to 10 years in city building before this pandemic. Of course, this pandemic has put the conversation on hyperdrive and the action in cities on hyperdrive around the transformation of street space for safer and more effective bike travel, pedestrian travel, transit travel, etc. Here's how I like to look at it. There's at least 2 different ways you can have this conversation, and one of them I'm not a big fan of. It's this sort of conversation that says this is about an object, a bike, which is preferred over another object, a car, and it pits activists, so-called activists, against the champions of the status quo of car dependency and car dominance. And it can come across as that kind of a debate. And anyone who's not in those 2 categories of people, doesn't put themselves in those categories of people, thinks it's not about them. I'm not a big fan of that kind of a debate because it's very reductionist and it just sort of pits 2 false choices against each other. How I like to look at it is I come at it from the perspective of I'm not a cycling advocate, an activist. I'm a city advocate. I like cities that work better in actually achieving all of our stated goals, whether those goals are climate emergency or better mobility, actually moving more people with less space and less public money and better public health and less emissions. Just cities that work more effectively, also in the context of affordability, in the context of equity, social equity. When you build bike infrastructure, it works better for everyone, including cars. And I think I prefer to take it out of the conversation of which object do you like better, or which activist or sort of voice is being louder in the discourse, and pull it back into a conversation of what do our cities need to do to actually succeed if we take our stated goals seriously. And one of the things we need to succeed is completely rethink the dominance we have given in the public space, the life between buildings, to cars. Because ironically, it doesn't even work for drivers. The one thing we know is that if everyone's trying to drive, nobody moves well. That is a proven fact in every city. And by the way, when you add more lanes and you add more freeways, it just induces more driving and the congestion actually gets worse. So this false narrative of cyclists versus drivers or any of the false narratives in this conversation aren't particularly helpful. We know that when you design a city for cars, it fails for everyone, including drivers. When you design a city that's multimodal, that makes other choices enjoyable, with safe infrastructure for walking, biking, and transit, it works better for everyone, including drivers. So this false narrative, this fake, false, bullshit narrative about the war on the car that was actually created originally by Rob Ford in Toronto, it is very unhelpful for everyone, including the driving agenda, because what I always say is anybody who tells me, but Brent, I need to drive, or there's social forces at play, including racism, that would want people to drive more, I always respond then that the best thing anyone who wants or needs to drive can hope for is that other people will choose to walk, bike, and take public transit, so you won't be competing with those people for that finite amount of space. And the only way they will choose those things is to make the infrastructure safe and enjoyable. As I say, there's about 1,000 ways I could have tackled that question, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mayor Helps.
Well, no, and I just, it's so refreshing because I think one of the, and I see it in the exact same way, but people look at me like I've got something wrong with my head when I say, if we build these bike lanes, it's actually going to be easier for you to drive. Like so I think and I think it's because a lot of, the general public aren't necessarily systems thinkers. Some are, but we're really talking about a transportation ecosystem and more than that, a well-being ecosystem in a city. And I think that the other reason that I like your framing is because I just think there's generally way too much polarization, period. And this versus that, whether it's cars versus cyclists or, whites versus blacks or activists versus police, or this versus that as a society, which is becoming the norm in terms of how we have a discourse about anything, I think really doesn't get us anywhere. And it certainly doesn't build understanding.
Agreed. But here's the challenge that I push back on myself on even. Everything we've just said, I agree and believe with, but there's a real risk that cities, when responding to this narrative that no, I don't believe that bike infrastructure will make it easier for me to drive. The risk is those people may be right if the city does the bike infrastructure badly. And there's a few different ways you can do the bike infrastructure badly. And one of the worst ones is to do it to use a very technical term, in a very half-assed way. You do just enough bike infrastructure to cause a disruption, but not enough to actually create the mode shift that makes the driving easier. You do it too slow, which my own former city, Vancouver, did. I used to say every time we would open up a new bike lane, I'd go onto the media and answer the two most frustrating questions. One, why aren't there a lot of cyclists? Well, because it's just one bike lane. It's not a network. And two, are we done now? No, we're not done now. Would we be done if we had built one sidewalk or one laneway for cars, street lane for cars? So there's a risk to doing it slowly. Vancouver, for various reasons, did it slowly. I called it pulling the Band-Aid off slowly. It was painful. And we didn't actually get to the point where people saw the benefits until much later. The risk of that is that halfway through, a city can't take the political blowback anymore and just stops. And you never have gotten to the point where it's actually working the way that you and I are talking about Mayor Helps. So I'm a much bigger fan and have had many conversations with the cities that have done the complete pilot, starting with Calgary, my other former city I used to plan for, that did a complete, at least downtown network all at once. And then Edmonton, who always has to compete with Calgary, thankfully, it's wonderful, not just on hockey, but on city building. They one-upped it and they didn't even do it a pilot. They just built it as a complete network in the downtown and made it permanent. That's how we have to do it more. Learn from the mistakes of the cities that did it in a half-assed way and either made it harder than they needed to or failed. You do it to the point where you can show the success, see the success, have the success actually realized.
So now in those cities, in Calgary and Edmonton or other examples, what happened with the small business community? Because as you know, we've talked about a lot on this show, small business is the backbone of the economy, one of the largest employers out there. So how does it impact them, boots on the ground?
Well, I know this from both Calgary and Edmonton. There was initially concern and a blowback. The vote in Calgary to pass the pilot was a squeaker. I think the pilot was authorized by one vote on council. But they did what I called almost the perfect pilot. They had exceptional pre-data, the data on what was happening before. They actually, they budgeted it very carefully with good information. They came out a few months later and announced quick wins to show actual momentum of success. They came in under budget and they had the data to show that it worked. So when the vote came to actually make it permanent, there wasn't this large outcry from the local business community that it was hurting their business because the data showed that it wasn't. And the actual vote from Calgary, and I got to tell you, for those of you who don't know the politics in Calgary, it's pretty hard to achieve this. The vote was unanimous to make the pilot permanent because there wasn't that blowback. To use another example that's my favorite here in Vancouver, the loudest and most effective voice against bike lanes as the city was incrementally building the bike infrastructure was the Downtown Business Association, the downtown business community, that said it was going to kill street retailing because of the impact of removing some parking. And the city did it. I won't say the city did it anyway, because that sounds very flippant and cavalier. And frankly, they did it in a slow way, in part because of that blowback from the various voices, including the business community. But here's the point. The number one voice now for more bike infrastructure is the Downtown Business Association. They come out to council every single time. Why? Because the studies and the data after, they had good before information and they followed up with good after information, showed that there wasn't a negative impact. In fact, the street retailing benefits. We see study after study that shows that people on bikes and walking and taking public transit actually spend more per month than people in cars. Not more per trip, but more overall per month. They make more trips and they spend more cumulatively. So it's better for business. We know that. The data shows that. And in Vancouver, the site-specific analysis showed that. So I love every time the downtown business community comes out, they're often one of the first speakers in the public discourse at council. And they always start their talk by saying, as you recall, council, we were initially against bike infrastructure. But we have seen from the data, from our members' observations, that we were wrong. And we have thus changed our position. There's nothing more powerful in the public discourse than someone who used to be against something, but now has been convinced by actual evidence as opposed to rhetoric or anecdote.
Yeah, and business people are numbers people. So yeah, if they're seeing proof in the pudding, then yeah, they're going to support it, definitely. So can you tie that in, the bike lanes, into what we're currently our current reality with COVID? Because being outside, we had a discussion in another segment of the show talking about how the initial thought of the racial protests in the States and in Victoria were going to result in spikes in outbreaks of COVID. And the reality is they haven't. And the only thing that scientists that I've heard anyway, I'm not a scientist or a doctor, but I've heard is that the fact that they're outside, that people are outside, if they're wearing masks and outside, that significantly reduces the ability to transmit. So now you're talking bike lanes, you're outside, you're exercising. Have you seen any data, any research on how it impacts COVID, whether it's good or whether it's bad, or do you have no information on that at all?
Well, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to throw in, to add to the question, and you referenced it earlier, is, you were working with and looking at cities around the world. What are you seeing in terms of, the change that many of us have wanted to happen is now happening, and how's that going? Are people accepting, some people here in Victoria are like, well, you're just using COVID as an excuse. And no, actually COVID is the reason that we need to make this transformational change. But yeah, just curious to hear your thoughts on that in addition to answering Dave's question.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, the fascinating thing, I'm fascinated by language, and we've got to be very deliberate in our language. I've tried my best, although I occasionally slip, to stay away from words like, we have an opportunity because of this pandemic. There's nothing, I don't feel like that kind of an optimistic word is appropriate. But what I do say is, we had, before this pandemic, a remarkable responsibility based on what the American medical system would call pre-existing conditions for our cities. I was already talking about what I call the 5 crises of cities before we were facing this pandemic. Number one being obviously the climate crisis. And I know Victoria was one of the Canadian cities that early on declared the climate emergency. We had pre-existing crises that required change. The pandemic, which is either a new crisis or an extension of the first crisis, given that we know that climate change actually causes or exacerbates more and worse pandemics as one of its many consequences. We had another reason, another responsibility to take action, both temporarily and permanently, to make our cities work better, both to address the pandemic and the recovery period of the pandemic, but also the pre-existing conditions that we can't ignore. Because there was a real danger that in our reaction to the pandemic, we ended up doing stupid things that actually made our pre-existing conditions worse. The most obvious example is if in our cities, we end up driving more and taking public transit less. Because of this narrative that we're going to be afraid viral spread and consider our cars safe, which is ironic since cars are the least safe way to get around in our cities. If we drive more, if we double down and put our foot on the gas towards more emissions in response to the fear of the climate of the pandemic, or if we as decision makers put public money, stimulus money, into doubling down on car infrastructure, we create a self-fulfilling prophecy that actually leads to worse and faster climate change with many consequences, including more and worse pandemics. So there has been a very big responsibility, a very big risk that we would end up making changes in our cities as a result of this pandemic that make our future worse in many ways, not the least of which is from a pandemic perspective.
And are you seeing that?
Yes, we saw that immediately in Wuhan, one of the first cities to shut down. They came back with even more driving. Now, the question is that a temporary thing, or is that something that lasts? The two things that will determine that, because I'm a planner, not a hoper and a finger crosser, the two things that will determine whether or not that is permanent is if we invest our public money in facilitating that driving, and we invest more public space into facilitating that driving, then we've created the scenario where more driving will happen. So actually government action probably has a much bigger implication for whether we drive more than our individual fears, because our individual fears will go away. But the infrastructure we build because of that fear will be with us for a long time. So we saw Wuhan come back. The other thing that will determine whether or not that's permanent is, you know what? I lost it. I can't remember what my other point was. I'm just having too much fun with you, Mayor Helps.
Yeah.
But the point is, I've said we have to be very, very deliberate in our conversation about what will happen. One of the most common questions I get asked is, are you hopeful that good things will happen as a result of the changes we make to cities in the pandemic and such? And I say, I'm not hopeful. I'm actually quite concerned, but what I am is determined that we have the proactive and deliberate conversation about the real costs and consequences of going down the wrong path as a result of the fear that we feel because of this pandemic. And we end up creating long-term problems for us, no matter how long the short-term consequences of the pandemic are with us.
And again, looking around the world right now, so Wuhan is a good example. They were the first in and the first out, in a sense. I think of cities like Paris or Oakland, California. Yeah. Oakland, California. Those are the stories that we hear. You know, the mayor of Paris is building this many kilometers of bike lane. Oakland has shut down 74 miles of streets. Yes. So those are, I'm not hearing the people driving more stories. I'm hearing the bold moves by local elected officials around the world stories. And
well, I'm hearing both, and it's probably because of who you and I are following on Twitter. There, but
right, that self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, the challenge is for every good news story we hear about proactive thinking, and I put good news in quotes because there's nothing good about this situation.
Yeah.
But for every story we hear about cities being proactive, and particularly the European cities, starting with Milan and others, were the ones that were built, and Paris later on, were the first ones to build permanency into their temporary strategy. First of all, there were a lot of cities that weren't building temporary strategies at all. How many weeks are we into the pandemic now? When we all started this, a number of us were out calling immediately for mayors and directors of planning and transportation officials to include in their response to the pandemic a strategy for this. And some did very quickly, mostly the Latin American cities, because they are good at acting faster than we are. They're better at acting faster than we are, and they already had a culture of street transformation where North American cities did not. But Latin American cities were some of the first to act. Canadian cities then followed with small moves, intermittent moves. Calgary was ironically one of the first, and they closed 5 or 6 streets to cars and opened them to people, but only on weekends. And it was a pilot, and then it went away. And it wasn't hyper local in a network. It was destinations that you had to sort of go to. And they never followed up. The Canadian cities generally for a while didn't follow up with this sort of more holistic and complete response. Then we saw American cities starting with Oakland. Who'd have thought that Oakland would be the superhero of this movement in North America, with their big move of 10% of their street space transformed in a very simple, non-sexy, hyper-local way, which provides distribution and equity and connection. They became, I can't believe how many cities were referencing Oakland in their staff reports, which I suspect had never happened before. And then the European cities came along and were not only doing big transformative moves, but they were already talking about permanency, because they were the ones who were talking about the pre-existing conditions. They already had a problem of urban pollution. They already wanted to address climate change. They already wanted to improve public life and quality of life. So they obviously saw the need to include a permanency lens in these moves. And Milan was one of the first. In North America, Seattle was the probably first North American city to include permanency in their messaging, and it started to grow. And then we saw the Canadian cities sort of come back after being behind. The big ones, Montreal particularly, Vancouver with its slow streets, and then Toronto, and a number of other mid-sized cities, including Victoria, came out with their strategies, their bigger moves. We sort of came from behind. America had passed us, but then we passed them again with big moves. And all of this was in the conversation of what's the smart thing to do during the pandemic to provide mental respite, physical exercise, fresh air. You guys made the point that all the evidence shows being outside is better. And yet at the beginning of the pandemic, we were sending this mixed message. Stay at home was the main message, which literally means stay inside. But at the same time, we were saying, but you can go out if you do it safely and with physical distancing to get exercise and mental respite. The challenge is the physical city that you were going out into didn't necessarily always facilitate that safe behavior. And hence this need to have the conversation about transforming streets and neighborhoods in an equitable and distributed way. So all of this was happening. I could track the way the conversation is going based on the questions I've been getting in media interviews from the very beginning to now. And almost every week, the questions have been slightly different. My responses have definitely been different as this evolution across the world has been happening in how cities have been responding. And then, of course, as an overlap, on top of the mobility and social connection and social bridging outside, we had the issue of the restaurant recovery, which ironically, actually, I think captured the imagination of more municipal councils than the mobility piece. Because I like to say, whether you're a right-wing council or a left-wing council, economics and business matters to you.
And you still like to eat.
Yeah, yes. But yes, we like to eat. It's a socialization, but it's also a way to help small business. And whether you're right wing or left wing, it's hard to argue that. So that became actually a more powerful reason to reconsider the dominance of the car in our public space than mobility for people was. That's ironic. It's a bit frustrating, but it's reality. And whatever it takes to get a foot in the door into the transformation of streets and public spaces. And that started with another unlikely hero. I said Oakland has been cited in 1,000 staff reports. Vilnius has been cited in 1,000 staff reports because suddenly cities were like Calgary and Edmonton were referencing Vilnius, Lithuania, because they were the first to announce that they were closing down their entire central area to become one large open air cafe. And I was doing a media interview with CBC National, the National, and they asked me, what city should we get some film from? Should we go to Paris or should we go to some North American city? I said, go to Vilnius. And they got some great, they got an independent contractor to do some great interviews in Vilnius. And that was on the National the week later. And it was a conversation about not just mobility and people, but it was also about economic recovery and saving our small businesses, helping our restaurants. And I say that's great. There's about 100 different reasons why we need to transform our public life between buildings, as Jan Gehl would put it, to do more things than just move and store cars. So whatever it is that gets a particular council with a particular political bent to reconsider that dominance, it's probably a good thing. I will give the caveat, as we all should now, that there has to be a social equity lens to that. There certainly has to be a racism and a truly comprehensive perspective on what safety means in streets as part of that conversation. But I don't see a reason why that needs to paralyze the conversation or slow it down. You just need to include the right people in the conversation and decision making. Make sure you've got that lens and perspective as part of your decision making. You can still be fast and include the right people in the conversations and diverse people in the conversations, because I don't want that to be a false choice that paralyzes our action.
And on that note, Brent, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you being here. It was very informative, and clearly we could go on. There's more to discuss as COVID unfolds and as cities recover and as businesses recover and people recover.
Brent, thank you, and keep going. Your Twitter presence is really important, I think, you've got really great information to share, and I think that really broad perspective just beyond one city or another. So thanks for taking the time to join us this morning.
My pleasure. My apologies for the long answers. We probably could have fit some more questions in there. And Mayor Helps, I'm a big fan of what you are doing in Victoria. I watch it very closely. Victoria is an important city for all of us and for me. And the initiative and leadership around bike infrastructure and other aspects of smarter city building, it's noticed. You're not the biggest city in Canada, but you're doing big things, and we really appreciate that. Because frankly, there's more cities of your size and scale in Canada than there are big cities. So what you're doing can be inspirational to a lot of cities in Canada.
Great. Well, that's our aim.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining the Mayor Helps on Tundra Media. If you enjoyed the show, please like, share, and subscribe. And visit themayorhelps.com to submit your questions to the show.